I remember always as a child being told, you can't play here, you can't play there, you can't do that, you might damage a priceless tapestry, you'll damage one of the paintings or whatever it was. It was a little restricting. This is a picture of my mother painted by my father. As I was saying, he was quite a good amateur painter at one moment, and then afterwards he gave it up and started collecting pictures. This is a picture of my father painted by himself. Then here is my mother, a statue prepared by two friends, American friends, whom she met on one of her cruises, in a sort of typical energetic gesture. That's Abraham Pasha, who is my great-grandfather. He was my father's mother's father. She was Anna Karakeya. He was Abraham Pasha Karakeya. That's my uncle Nubar, Calouste Gulbenkian's son. Two pictures of him. This is the picture you all well know of my grandparents' 60th wedding anniversary up on the terrace. That is my mother with our two children, Martin and Joanna, when they were small. That's my grandfather. That was given to us when we were in Armenia. I was born in London in 1927, and my parents and I moved to Paris when I was about 5 years old. And the house was not far from the Avenue d'Iéna. And then, when I was about 7 or 8 years old, we moved into the Avenue d'Iéna. Up till then, I had visited it quite often in order to visit my grandparents who were living there. I mean, I remember my mother always saying that he really only had 3 great interests in life, which was oil, art, and horticulture. Oh, he checked all the expenses, wanted to know the number of cutlets had been ordered, who had eaten them, and nothing had been wasted. And in particular, I remember that my grandmother had a pot of face cream, and he went through the accounts, found the charge of the pot of face cream, and couldn't see that 6pence had been reclaimed on the pot when it was empty. And I think there was about £5 worth of telegrams going between Lisbon and Paris, trying to find out why the pot of cream had not been reclaimed at another 6pence when it was empty. And he took enormous trouble about the enclos, replanting trees and laying out flower beds and everything else. No, it gave him an enormous amount of pleasure. And he had quite a number of animals he kept. He had a lot of birds and built them special, lovely, and all the hens, he built them special, lovely little houses, which I think are still there. And he also, I remember, had 2 bull calves after the war. My grandfather lunched at 3 p.m. and by himself, though he sometimes invited one family to come and sit with him. He had a Turkish chef and a Greek chef cooking for him. He ate very simply, but all the best ingredients always, with very good wine. Then at 1 o'clock, the family lunched, the rest of us lunched together. That would be my grandmother, my mother, my father and I, in the dining room again. And then there was also a separate dining room for the senior staff in the office, all the secretarial staff, and then the main body of the servants ate separately again. We were cooked for by Sotiris, I seem to remember his name, the Greek chef, and there was a French cook, Thérèse, who cooked for the staff.
He had this amazing attention to detail and absolute obsessiveness, and yet he didn't seem to get much pleasure out of the house.
My grandfather took an enormous pride in it and took an enormous amount of trouble about the design which he had done, etc. I don't know that he was all that happy at the end. In fact, at one moment I remember he's telling me he thought it was the biggest mistake he'd ever made and he'd never do it again. My grandmother used to complain that she had endless trouble looking after all the servants and the staff and everything else. And my grandfather didn't have very much sympathy and used to say, I told you that if you married me, I'd build you a palace. I never promised you that you'd enjoy it. which was rather typical. Rather a lot of staff. I always remember the figure being quoted as 25 staff, which does seem rather a lot. I mean, of which a number did in fact live in the house. I mean, it's quite a large staff. There was a butler, 3 footmen, my mother's maid, my grandmother's maid. My grandfather had 1 or 2 valets. There was also a laundress and an assistant laundress. There was also an engineer who was responsible for the running of the boilers downstairs, with an enormous installation of oil-fired boilers for providing the central heating and all the facilities of the house. And I always remember him because he was a delightful man who used to come up and help me with my electric train. If it got a short circuit and the thing didn't work, I used to ring up, des fretins, il marche pas mon train. He used to come up and look after it.
Your grandfather took a huge interest in the organisation of the house, but most of the day-to-day running was done by your grandmother. How did that work?
She was the maîtresse de maison, and very proud and very happy to do it. And she was very good at it, at running the staff, although she did complain about all the worries there were. But I always remember her complaining that before the war there had been 4 footmen. And after the war, I think my grandfather decided we ought to be more economical, and there were only 3 footmen. And I can still hear her saying, "On ne peut pas faire un bon service avec seulement 3 valets de pied."
During the war, when your grandparents left for Vichy in 1940 and then on to Portugal in 1942, your parents stayed in the house. What did you hear about that period?
I remember hearing afterwards that Goering had had his eye on the house, which he thought would make a suitable residence for him. And on one occasion, some of his staff came to the house, and they went round looking and saying, "This will be the marshal's bedroom, this will be the marshal's office," etc., etc. And so my father went off to the Swiss embassy, who were looking after the interests of all diplomatic buildings which enjoyed diplomatic status. And my grandfather had been a member of the Persian diplomatic mission, because his mother had had Persian nationality. And so my father went and remonstrated that this building had diplomatic status. And there was no question of the Germans taking it over, which was effective. And in fact, they left it alone. There weren't many visitors because my grandfather did not like people coming to the house. In fact, I remember in the front hall, there was a Rodin statue, a very impressive statue, of one of the burghers of Calais with a rope around his neck and holding the keys. And I believe my grandfather is supposed to have said at one moment, "That is meant to be a warning to what may happen to people who try coming into my house."
And your mother?
My mother was very social and had a vast number of friends and didn't like the restrictions that were imposed on people coming to the house. I remember at one moment after the war, she had to submit the name of 5 friends for my grandfather's approval, whom she would be allowed to invite into the house. Well, she had infinitely more friends than that. So when she wanted to entertain any of the others, she used to entertain them on the public bench outside in the Avenue d'Iéna. And the butler would bring the drinks out to the public bench sitting outside.
She had a certain style about it.
Yeah, no, she managed.
Where was most of the collection? Was it concentrated in certain areas of the house?
Most of the collection was either on the ground floor or on the first floor, in the suite of rooms, of reception rooms on the first floor. Also in the dining room, there were some magnificent tapestries on the wall, 4 of them, showing scenes from paradise, with little naked cherubs climbing up trees and doing things, which had been made for either a pope or a cardinal, who'd refused to have them unless the artist had put little trousers for decency's sake on the cherubs. The artist refused, and so they were never taken up by the cardinal, etc. Also, I remember on the sideboard in the dining room, there was all the silver which my grandfather had acquired from the Hermitage, including some very fine pieces by Thomas Germain. And then also on the second floor, as part of my grandmother's suite, there was her boudoir, which had some extremely fine tapestries round the walls, which were, I think, French tapestries, showing Chinese scenes.
Were there any pieces that you were particularly fond of? I believe you built up quite a relationship with Eve, didn't you?
I don't have a particular relationship with many of the pieces, except one, which was, as you say, the statue of Eve at the bottom. It was at the bottom of the staircase leading from the second floor down to the first floor where the dining room was. And it was a little statue of Eve, naked, bent double on her knees, weeping, because she'd been driven out of the Garden of Eden. And I'd been told at school that it was Eve who was responsible for us being thrown out of the Garden of Eden. And so every time I came down to lunch, I used to kick her naked backside. And as a result, it was covered in black boot polish after a very short time. Louis XV usually has that little rose or little something at the back, and if you lean back on it, it always catches you in the back of the neck. My mother used to complain there isn't a single comfortable armchair in this house, which was probably true. I don't think my grandfather ever sat in an armchair. I mean, he was always at his desk. No, there was a lot of very good furniture. I remember I was told at school, I went to a French school nearby, that there were some children in Paris who lived in houses where water came in through the roof, and they were known as slums, taudis in French. And as the terrace on the roof sometimes used to leak water through its mosaic floor, there was a bucket outside my grandmother's bedroom into which the water used to leak, and I remember the child saying, "Grandma, why do we live in a slum?" I've been told, she said, "What do you mean a slum?" And I said, "I've been told at school that places where the water comes in through the roof are known as slums." Didn't go down very well.